Hello, my name is Renee Ellis. Thank you for joining me today um, to talk about qualitative methods for exploring common pathways through web survey instruments. So, Paradata is a place where big data and survey methodology meet. Web Paradata has the qualities of big data. They are large, unstructured data sets. The data wasn't originally intended for analysis. However, Web Paradata records the behaviors of human respondents like a lot of big data, and that can be useful for understanding how respondents interact with the survey instrument. And it can be used to monitor survey responses and help us identify areas for improvement. Web Paradata is increasingly used to improve surveys, but there's actually still a lot of information contained in Web Paradata that we don't use. Because the data is very complex and unstructured, it provides some analysis challenges. And so we often use the user's actions separately. We look at individual actions like whether they triggered an error or whether they moved forward or back on a page, instead of looking at the interrelated characteristics of the full survey pathway. Now, many of the methods that we use for big data, such as machine learning, can be used to analyze web paradata. However, data science can sometimes overlook the understandings that we've created in survey methodology that we've accumulated over years of study. And some of those qualitative insights have sometimes get lost when we look at big data types of problems. So qualitative methods can really be used to inform our understanding of pathways through surveys captured in web paradata, because it can look holistically at the whole pattern and across the interrelatedness of that pattern. And so we can use those findings to better inform our quantitative methods in order to create better indicators for survey instrument design and improvement. So that's really been my goal of my research. I'm really looking to create more nuanced web paradata indicators that we can use in survey analysis, design, and improvement, and especially looking to consider the entire pathway of the survey. So my research plan sort of has these 4 steps. I've finished this first step in green. Was my qualitative deep dive into a sample of web paradata. I looked at a household survey, and I developed some patterns using that. And I have some of those patterns throughout the talk today. I also have some supplemental slides that you might want to look at that talk more about those patterns and more about the overall structure of Paradata and how I used it in my qualitative research. But today I'm really going to talk about the validation of those patterns in another survey of a different type. So I'm comparing my household survey to an establishment survey to look at how that works. My next step is to build some quantitative analysis programs that can take these new indicators I've found using qualitative research and create things that we can actually analyze with a program in large quantities of data. And then my next step is to create machine learning models trained with the new indicators and compare those with untrained models. So today, the questions I'm going to concentrate on are, do we see the same patterns of behavior in different types of surveys? And are there any new patterns we find? What considerations do we need to make about survey type and structure when I start to create those quantitative indicators? That's something I really want to think about as I compare surveys. So the methods that I used to start with was I took a qualitative deep dive into the patterns of individual indicators in the original sample. And I used those patterns to build a typology of looking at survey behavior across the user pathway. I repeated the same thing for the comparison sample. And then I re-examined the original sample for anything new that I found in the comparison sample. So there are some differences structurally in the way the surveys were designed. The demographic household survey I used was a very complex household survey. It was nationally representative. It was very long. It was for all members of the household. And the reference person of the household was the person who answered the questions. The establishment survey was a much shorter survey. It was a survey of facilities, and some sort of administrator answered those questions. Both of the data sets are from 2018. My sample size of my first sample was about 100 cases, but I found that I had hit a threshold, had hit saturation where I wasn't finding any new patterns much before I hit 100 cases. And so I only drew about 50 from the establishment survey because I figured that would be sufficient. Now, there are some structural differences in the way the survey is administered. So things like error triggers. Um, an error comes up only for key questions in the demographic household survey I analyzed, where anytime you skip a question in the establishment survey I analyzed, you would get a trigger. So there are those kinds of structural differences in the way the survey was formatted. However, the parsed output of the Paradata was exactly the same. And the Paradata actions in both surveys are the same. And this is true of most Paradata. Once we parse it, it has very similar structure, and then that allows us to compare it. Now, I did expect to see some differences because of the types of respondents, household reference person versus employee. And I thought that that might be meaningfully different in terms of engagement or how dedicated they were to complete the survey. But I figured that that regardless of whether it's a household survey or an establishment survey, similar human behaviors will probably create similar patterns. So I expected to see a lot of similarity. There were three sort of components to the qualitative analysis that I did and then repeated in in the comparison survey. First, I looked at those indicators that were sort of single indicators and pretty easy to interpret. So whether someone completed the survey or not, the number of sessions it took, the use of help. These don't really need extra categorization for us to understand what they mean. However, there are other indicators that may cover up multiple behavior patterns. For instance, backing, changing answers without backing, missing data. So someone may back because they just want to verify and make sure they did something correct, or they may back because they were unsure of their answer or thought of something else to add. So there are different patterns that might underline that. So I broke those down into categories that show different kinds of behaviors. Then I combined steps 1 and 2 along with the qualitative observations that I was making in order to assess the user pathways. So I set some criteria up in things like engagement or disengagement, ease or difficulty, and I created a typology of user behaviors across the survey pathways using all of this information. So these are those indicators that I was talking about that I started with in that first step. So in this green box here, we have basically those behaviors that were pretty easy to interpret. And you can see that they occur in both surveys, but there are some things that might be different in terms of percentages, in terms of frequency. So for instance, establishment surveys were about 90% done on laptops and desktops instead of tablets or mobile phones, where that was more split for household surveys. There were a lot more failed logins in establishment surveys, and a lot more people who completed in more sessions instead of a single session in establishment surveys. Now, in terms of this orange box, these are some of those indicators that might be a little bit more difficult to interpret. And in terms of just them existing, they existed in both surveys, but again, had different percentages. So there were a lot more people in the household survey, or a lot more surveys where people skipped at least one question or backed, but changing answers without backing happened a lot more in the establishment survey. So these are some of those indicators that I split out into categories. Down here at the bottom are answer changes that happened without backing. And I split those into two sort of categories: correcting, which is sort of just fixing a typo or adding words to something that you were writing, and recategorizing, which is changing an answer category in a question that wasn't open-ended, sometimes multiple times. Now, the establishment survey had more of those closed-ended questions, which is most likely why that they have a higher number of those, where the household survey has more of the correcting behaviors. In terms of backing behaviors, I found 5 types of backing behaviors, and I found them across both surveys. And I'm not going to look at all of these, but for instance, verifying, which is backing without an answer change, happened a lot more in the establishment surveys. And so did behaviors like looping. Looping is when users back through the same questions and change answers multiple times, which sometimes indicates problems with the question or difficulties with the question. Now, the reason perhaps that these had higher rates in the comparison sample in the establishment survey is that I found a new pattern. About 20% of the comparison sample navigated to sections out of order or revisited sections, and they did this using the menu or the dashboard instead of backing. Now, this behavior actually did exist in the original sample when I went back and looked, but it was much less frequent. It was less than 5%. And using the dashboard, though, when I really looked into it, seemed to be a shortcut to backing. It exhibited the same behavior patterns evident in verifying, revisiting, and looping. And so what I did for now is I coded these behaviors into the backing behaviors because they were so similar in the behavior. And so that's probably why there are higher percentages in the establishment survey, because they had more instances of using that kinds of behavior. Now, it could be possible as the quantitative coding proceeds that we'll need to consider the possibility of recording these patterns separately, or perhaps establishment surveys might think that they matter enough that they should be a separate pattern. In terms of missing data, I found 5 patterns in the household survey, and only 2 of those patterns really held for the establishment survey. This is partially because of the structure of the survey. Unintentional skips are when you move past a question and don't answer it, and you can't do that when you have a error every time you skip a question, so those weren't possible. The other thing that was really not existing in the establishment surveys were those people who didn't answer sensitive questions but otherwise were engaged and answered the survey questions. And this is partly because I couldn't really determine sensitive questions for the establishment survey. We have existing research to determine sensitive questions for household surveys, but establishment surveys are all very different, and I didn't have a good background for that, where someone maybe who worked on the survey could have. I didn't find any questions that seemed to have a pattern of a lot of people not answering them. And so for now, I just don't have them in the privacy aware category. Now, when we move from all of those individual indicators and putting them all together into a typology, we end up with 6 different categories. And 5 of these were found also in the establishment survey. The one that wasn't was that confidential and capable. Again, that was the sensitive questions, privacy questions, and because I couldn't find those in that survey, there's no one in that category. However, in terms of the other 5, there are some really interesting things that happened here. I consider the 2 of these categories as being sort of 2 ends of the spectrum. The eager completers are our people that we really want in our survey. They're our best behaved people. They're highly engaged. They do a good job with the survey. They make sure that their questions are complete. And the percentage was exactly the same in both surveys. On the other end, the doubtful and disengaged are the ones who don't try very hard, tend to not complete the survey. When they do complete the survey, they tend to have high amounts of missing data. And that's about the same, 14 to 16%, pretty close in those surveys. So I found it really interesting that those 2 categories that are sort of the bookends of really good and really bad behavior were pretty similar. There was a little bit of difference in some of these other categories, particularly the dutifully disinterested category. But overall, the same patterns exist, even though the frequency of those patterns varied. I did only find that one new pattern that emerged, and it did exist in my original sample. The navigating to different sections, which I found in the second sample, is often done instead of backing, and it follows the same patterns as backing behavior. So that competent and confidential typology didn't exist in the comparison survey, and the percentage of dutiful and defeated was much lower. This is likely due to differences in privacy patterns and the perception of burden. The comparison pattern had a higher percentage of dutifully disinterested so the establishment survey, and this could be related to the survey completion being a job duty. So when I think about the next steps, first of all, qualitative research is really great and really helpful, but it's also very time consuming, and it's not ideal as a primary method for analyzing patterns in large samples of Paradata, particularly if you have these large surveys that are done frequently. So this research indicates that we can move from this qualitative research and hopefully create some quantitative programs that can find these surveys in surveys of different types and complexity. Although we do have to consider that some behaviors are more common in different types of surveys, this may indicate that when we create those quantitative analysis programs, we might have to consider the survey type when creating thresholds. In other words, that what cases particular behaviors are something that we need to be concerned about. And also when we create those programs, we might need specialized information about what questions might be considered sensitive or particular information about survey design in order to adjust the programs for surveys. But we can create these programs. We might just need to tweak them for each individual survey slightly. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your time. I have some supplemental slides for you, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks.